"You will never see your daughter alive again." Those were the words Betty's husband whispered in her ear when she tried to escape for the third time. For 18 months she was held as a prisoner in Iran with her 4-year-old daughter, stripped of her passport, her rights, and her dignity, watched, threatened, turned into the property of the man who had promised to love her forever. That man was her husband. Betty Mahmoody believed a lie, a 2-week visit so Matub could meet her father's family. When the door closed behind them in Tehran, she realized they hadn't entered a home. They had entered a cage. And her 4-year-old daughter, crying for her brothers back in Michigan, couldn't understand why Mommy kept whispering, "We're leaving soon," but never left. Betty Mahmoudi was anything but a victim. At 39, she was a respected registered nurse in Alpena, Michigan, who had raised 2 sons on her own after her first divorce. Joe and John, her boys, saw her as a rock, a woman who worked double shifts at the hospital, paid the bills on time, and still find time to take them to the baseball games. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was her own savior. But there's something about strong women that makes them vulnerable to men who appear equally strong. Betty had learned not to trust easily after her first failed marriage. She had built high walls around her heart. So why did Moody manage to break them down so easily? The answer lay in something she never admitted to anyone, not even to herself. Dr. said Bozor Moody Mahmoudi wasn't just another man. He was an anesthesiologist, educated, well-traveled, and spoke about medicine and politics with an intelligence that impressed Betty. More importantly, he treated her children as if they were his own. At the hospital where they worked together, colleagues remarked on how dedicated he was, how he respected nurses, how he never raised his voice. He's different, Betty thought. He's safe. The wedding in 1977 seemed like the perfect fresh start. When Matcha was born in 1979, Moody cried with joy. He called her "my little moon" and spent hours singing Persian lullabies to help her sleep. The house was full of laughter, family dinners, and plans for the future. But somewhere between 1981 and 1984, the man Betty had fallen in love with began to disappear. And what took his place was something much darker. The first signs were subtle. Corrections on how she held Matchup. Comments about her American friends being a bad influence. Questions about where she had gone when she went out alone. Betty ignored them. After all, every marriage has its adjustments, right? She didn't know those small moments of control were being carefully tested. She didn't know that every yes she gave was another bear placed on her cage. And she definitely didn't know that that man lying next to her every night was already planning to take her to the other side of the world. Moody was different from any man Betty had ever met. When he walked through the hospital halls, he carried a presence, confidence without arrogance, intelligence without condescension. He spoke 3 languages fluently, had fascinating stories about growing up in Iran before the revolution, and when he had smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes hinted a man who had seen the world but still found joy in it. For a woman who had become weary after a painful divorce, he represented something rare, genuine masculine stability. What truly won Betty over wasn't his charm. She had learned to be skeptical of charming men. It was how he treated her children. Joe and John, though teenagers who had learned to distrust new men in their mother's life, genuinely liked him. Moody took them to baseball games, helped with homework, and never tried to position himself as a replacement father. He was respectful, patient, and seemed to understand that winning Betty's heart meant first earning the trust of her boys. When he proposed marriage in 1976, it was in the most American way possible. Down on one knee, diamond ring in hand, tears in his eyes. "I chose America," he told her. "I choose you. I chose this life." He had immigrated in 1961, built a respectable medical career, and spoke about the future with a conviction that was contagious. His stories about the Iran were always nostalgic, but always ended with gratitude for the life he had built in the United States. Wedding in 1977 was small, intimate, perfect. Moody cried when he said his vows. He promised to love and protect not only Betty but also Joe and John. When Meta was born in 1979, he held the baby as if she were made of crystal, whispering words in Persian that Betty didn't understand but that sounded like prayers. "Matop," he said. means moonlight. She will be our little light. In those early years, Betty believed she had finally found her forever. But there was something Moody never told Betty about himself. There was something about the way he spoke about family and tradition that she interpreted as universal values, when in reality they were specific codes. There was something about how he praised her for being different from other American women that she found romantic, when in truth it was a comparison that revealed how he really viewed American women. And there was something about the way he watched other interracial couples in public, a kind of silent judgment that Betty never picked up on, always there, waiting for the right moment to surface. The change began so subtly that Betty initially mistook it for marital maturity. Moody started to correct little things: how she held matchup, how she dressed when going out, how she spoke to other men at the hospital. In my culture, he began saying more often, wives do it this way. Betty, wanting to be a good wife, began making adjustments. She didn't realize that every concession she made was another bar being slowly placed around her freedom. The outburst started in 1982. Moody, who had never raised his voice before, began yelling when things weren't done the right way. He became furious when Betty made decisions about Matsup without consulting him. When she questioned his reactions, he blamed work stress, the racism he faced at hospital, the difficulty of being an Aryan man in America. Betty, always empathetic, began making excuses for him. He's going through a hard time, she told herself. He just needs understanding. But it wasn't just anger, it was paranoia. Moody began accusing Betty of trying to poison him. He inspected his food, sniffed his coffee, and once even drew the hole in the floor to listen for suspicious voices that existed only in his mind. He installed extra locks on the doors and started questioning Betty about every phone call, every visit, every minute she spent outside the house. You're conspiring against me, he said. You're trying to make me look crazy. The most disturbing transformation was how he spoke about identity. The man who once said, I chose America, now constantly talked about how American culture was corrupting their family. He began criticizing Betty for raising Matchup, too American, for not teaching her proper respect for men, for not covering her head at home. In Iran, he said with growing frequency, women know their place. In Iran, families stay together. In Iran, children respect their parents. Betty's friends began avoiding the house. Moody had become hostile to visitors, questioning why they came, how long they stayed, and what they talked about. He started intercepting phone calls and demanding to know the details of every conversation. Betty found herself lying to keep the peace, hiding social plans, avoiding situations that could trigger his anger. She didn't realize she was being systematically isolated. She didn't realize that the man who had fallen in love with her independence was now determined to destroy it. She definitely didn't realize that he was already planning a permanent solution for what he saw as her problem. She was too American to be a proper wife. It was on July morning on 1984 that Moody made the proposal that would change their lives forever. He was drinking coffee, reading the newspaper, seemingly calm, a version of him Betty hadn't seen in months. My mother died, he said without looking up. I need to go to Ireland for the funeral rituals. I want you and Mata to come with me. Betty almost choked on her coffee. Ireland was at war. The country was under sanctions. Americans were not welcome. Just 2 weeks, he continued, as if he was asking her to join him for a trip to the grocery store. Matab needs to meet her family. She needs to understand where she comes from. Betty's instinctive reaction was panic. She knew about American women who had vanished in Middle Eastern countries, about international custody cases where fathers simply never returned. Moody, the country is at war, she said. There's no American embassy. If something goes wrong. He cut her off with the charming version of himself she hadn't seen in a long time. Betty, I've lived in America for over 20 years. I've always come back from my trips. Do you think I would risk my medical career, our life here, our future? His words sounded rational, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. For weeks, the pressure continued. Moody alternated between emotional manipulation and persuasive logic. He talked about how Mata would benefit from knowing her cultural roots, how important it was for a child to understand her heritage. He showed pictures of cousins she never had met, told stories about family traditions she was missing. You're being selfish. he said when she resisted. You're denying our daughter the right to know her family. When Betty voiced her fears, he dismissed them as American paranoia, as prejudice against his culture. Turning point came when Moody threatened to go alone with Matchup. If you don't want to go, I understand, he said with a calm that was more terrifying than anger. But Matchup is my daughter too. She's going to meet her family, with or without you. Betty knew he could legally do it. She knew that if she let Matchup go without her, she might never see her again. In that moment, she realized she had no real choice. He had constructed the situation perfectly, a trap disguised as a family opportunity. All right, Betty finally said. But only 2 weeks, not a day longer. Moody smiled, a smile she should have recognized as triumph, not relief. Of course, he said. Just 2 weeks. As she agreed, Betty had no idea Moody had already contacted the relatives in Iran, already made plans that didn't include return tickets. She didn't know that in the drawers of his desk he had already hidden documents she had never seen. And she definitely didn't know that the man who had spent years earning her trust was about to use that trust to destroy her life. This airport was a sensory shock no amount of preparation could have softened. The August hit his body like a solid wall when she stepped out of the plane, carrying a drowsy and confused Matchup. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and something she couldn't quite identify. Fear, perhaps. Wrapped in black shadows moved like shadows through the halls, and armed guards barked commands in Persian she couldn't understand. Mommy, Matub whispered, I don't like the smell. Betty squeezed her daughter's hands, whispering that everything would be fine, though she didn't believe in herself. Customs was a nightmare. Official inspected every item in her luggage, questioning why she had brought certain cosmetics, why Matub had so many American toys. Moody translated selectively, and Betty suspected he wasn't telling her everything. When she asked to use the bathroom, she was escorted to a filthy latrine with a hole in the floor and a hose on the wall. Matub started to cry. It stinks so bad, she said. I can't do it. Betty took her back to the where Moody waited with an expression she had never seen before. Not concern, but something that looked almost satisfaction. What happened next sealed their fate. Moody discreetly handed over the American passport and a sum of money to a man Betty had never seen. Who is he? She asked. My nephew, Moody replied. He'll keep our documents safe. Betty watched in horror as their passports, their only proof of American citizenship, their only hope of living, disappeared into a stranger's coat pocket. Moody, I need those passports, she said. Don't worry, he replied. You won't need them here. In that moment, she realized she had made the most terrible mistake of her life. The trip to the family home was a surreal nightmare. More than 100 relatives gathered outside, shouting, crying, throwing flowers, everyone talking at once in Persian. Matub was snatched from Betty's arms and passed from person to person like a trophy. Cameras flashed. Everyone wanted to touch the American girl, tug her curly hair, pinch her cheeks. Betty tried to get her daughter back, but was shoved aside. Let them, Moody said. She's their family too. But there was something unsettling in the way they looked at Mattup, not as a visitor, but as something that had finally come home. The most sinister moment came when they arrived at the house. A sheep had been slaughtered in the yard, its blood still fresh on the concrete. It's a tradition, Moody explained, an honor for important guests. Betty had to step through the blood with Mattup in her arms to enter the house. When she hesitated, an elderly woman, Moody's sister, Amer Bozorg, shouted something in Persian that clearly wasn't kind. She said you're being disrespectful, Moody translated. She said you'd act like you're better than us. Betty realized that every move she made was being judged, every hesitation interpreted as American arrogance. She didn't know she was being tested, that every sign of discomfort was being carefully noted. And she definitely didn't know that the elderly woman glaring at her with contempt had already been told that Betty and Matthew would not be leaving in 2 weeks. It was on a stifling September afternoon, nearly a month into their stay in Iran, that Betty finally confronted Moody about their return plans. She had spent days searching for any sign that he was making arrangements to leave. Phone calls to airlines, conversations about packing, any indication that he would honor the 2 week deadline that had long since passed. Instead, she found Moody sitting calmly in the bedroom they shared, as it were any other day. Moody, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We need to talk about our flights. Matsup should have been back in school last week. Moody looked up from the book with an expression she had never seen before. Not anger, not madness, but something far more terrifying. Cold determination. Sit down, he said. Barry remained standing. We're not going back, he said simply, as if commenting on the weather. What do you mean, we're not going back? Betty asked, though deep down she knew the answer. I mean, this is our home now. Mata will be raised here with her real family. You will learn to accept it. His words were spoken so calmly that for a moment Betty thought she had misunderstood. Reality hit her like a physical blow. You lied to me, she whispered. You planned this from the beginning. Moody closed the Koran and stood. I saved our family. In America, you were corrupting Matop. She was becoming too American, too independent, too disrespectful. Here she will learn proper values. Here she will be a proper daughter. The room seemed to spin around Betty. And my boys, Joe and John were waiting for me. My father is sick. You can't just decide our life is over. But Moody had made the decision long ago. You made your choice when you married me, he continued. You made your choice when you came here. You are my wife. Matop is my daughter. Under Islamic law, under Iranian law, you belong to me. Betty tried to argue, tried to reason, tried to plead. She spoke of their careers, of the friends waiting for them, of the life they had built together. But for every argument, Moody had a simple response. That life is over. This is your life now. When she asked about the passports, he smiled. You won't need them anymore. You're Iranian now. That night, Betty couldn't sleep. She lay beside Matsup, who tossed restlessly, and realized the full magnitude of her situation. She was no longer a visitor. She was a prisoner. No longer an American citizen. She was her husband's property under Iranian law. No longer a mother with rights to her child. She was a woman who could have Matsup taken from her if she disobeyed. Every door she had walked through, every yes she had given Moody over the years, every concession she had made to keep the peace, all of it had led to this moment. She had been carefully manipulated, systematically isolated, and now was completely at the mercy of a man who had spent years planning her destruction. And the most terrifying part was that she had brought her 4-year-old daughter straight into the trap with her. Life in the Mahmoody family became a prison disguised as household. Betty woke before dawn to call to prayer echoing from loudspeakers across the city, a sound that became the soundtrack of her captivity. Amer Bozorg, Moody's eldest sister, ruled the house with an iron fist, dictating when Betty could eat, when she could breathe, and most of all, when she could or could not speak. You're in Iran now, she would say through Moody, who translated with growing satisfaction. You follow our rules. Betty was forced to wear the heavy cheder even inside the house whenever men were present, which was almost always. Matsup, at 4 years old, was suffering in ways that broke Betty's heart. The little girl who once danced in church and whispered bedtime prayers now woke up crying for her brothers back in Michigan. She developed chronic diarrhea from unfamiliar food. Mosquitoes bit her relentlessly, leaving infected sores on her arms and legs, and she was becoming increasingly withdrawn. Mommy, she asked over and over, why can't we go home? Betty didn't know how to explain to a 4-year-old that they no longer had a home to return to. Betty's attempts to seek help were met with a systematic frustration. She managed to contact the Swiss embassy, which represented America interested in Iran, but was given the brutal reality. Under Iranian law, she was now considered an Iranian citizen by marriage. Mahtab was also considered Iranian because her father was Iranian. Only with Moody's written consent could they leave the country. We can't do anything, the Swiss official said. You are subject to the local laws. Our hands are tied. Betty realized there were no higher authority to appeal to. No court would hear her case with sympathy. Moody's control over Betty intensified. She confiscated all the money she had, monitored every move, and forbade her from leaving the house without an escort. When she tried to talk about America or going home, He shouted at her in front of the entire family. "You will not speak of this," he said. "You are being disrespectful to our family." Once, when she insisted on discussing her sons in Michigan, he grabbed Matchup and said, "If you keep talking about America, I'll send Matchup to live with my cousins in the countryside. You'll never see her again." The threat worked. Betty learned to stay silent. But in her mind, Betty was constantly planning. She memorized street names, observed the family's movements patterns, and began discreetly identifying people who might sympathize with her situation. She found a teacher at Mathup School who whispered advice on how to navigate the system without drawing suspicion. Slowly, cautiously, she began building a network of contacts. People who understood she wasn't a rebellious wife, but an American prisoner. She didn't know it yet, but these secret contacts would become her only hope for survival. And somewhere deep in her mind, a terrible but necessary idea began to take shape. If she wanted to save her daughter, she would have to become someone she had never been before. She would have to become a fugitive. Betty's first escape plan was desperate and naive. Through Ellen, a translator quietly working with the Swiss embassy, she made contact with a taxi driver who promised to take them to the Pakistan border for $500. The plan was simple. Mata would be taken out of school for a doctor's appointment, and Betty would pretend to have a family emergency to leave the house. They would meet the driver at a specific street corner and drive through the night. Betty barely slept the night before, rehearsing every move, every word she would say. But on the planned morning, Moody broke his routine. "Today I'll take Matt up to school," he announced. There was no discussion, no negotiation. Betty watched from the window as her husband left with her daughter, knowing the plan had been discovered. It was never clear how Moody found out. Maybe someone had seen Betty talking to the driver. Maybe the Swiss embassy had been infiltrated. Maybe Amer Bozorg had overheard conversations Betty through her private. But one thing Betty knew for certain. She was being watched far more closely than she had realized. That night, Moody said nothing about the failed plan, but his message was clear. He knew, he always knew, she must never try again. But Betty did try again. This time she was more careful. She waited months, building trust, acting as if she had accepted her situation. She even began participating in family prayers, cooking Iranian dishes, pretending to adapt. Through a network of women at Mehtap School, she made contact with smugglers who knew the mountains between Iran and Turkey. They could guide her across the border on foot, a journey of several days that would be dangerous but possible. The price was steep, $4,000, but Betty had found a way to access an old bank account. The second plan was more elaborate. Betty taught Mehtap's secret codes, words that meant stay quiet or hide. She memorized maps, studied the weather, and even practiced walking long distance with her daughter on her back. The plan was to leave during a religious holiday when the family would be distracted by celebrations. She had coordinated with the guides, confirmed the route, and even prepared a small backpack with essential supplies. But on the eve of the escape, Moody made an announcement that shattered everything. "Tomorrow the whole family will go to the shrine. No one's stay home. No one lives alone." That's when Betty realized she wasn't just fighting Moody, she was fighting an entire system. A family that saw her as property, a community that reported her movements, and a government that didn't recognize her rights. Every person she met was a potential informant. Every conversation she had could be reported. Every moment of hope was followed by tighter surveillance. And worst of all, she knew Matchup was paying the price for her escape attempt. The little girl was becoming more withdrawn, more frightened, more traumatized with each passing day. The final threat came on December night after Moody discovered that Betty had been making contact with people outside the family. He grabbed her wrist, squeezed it until it hurt, and whispered the words she would never forget. "If you try to escape again, you will never see your daughter alive." It wasn't a figure of speech, it was a promise, and Betty knew he meant it. That night she realized her next move wouldn't just be about escape. They would be about survival. She couldn't fail again, because if she did, she wouldn't just lose her freedom. She would lose Matchup forever. Moody's threat echoed in Betty's mind for weeks. "You will never see your daughter alive." She knew these weren't empty words. There was something in his tone, in the coldness of his eyes that convinced her he was deadly serious. During the day, she pretended everything was normal. She cooked meals, followed the house rules, and smiled when expected. But at night, when everyone slept, she lay awake with a new, deeper terror. What if Moody decided she was too much trouble? What if she chose to get rid of her permanently and keep only Matip? In Iron, a man could do that. In Iron, no one would question it. The final waking point came on January morning 1986. Betty had gotten up early to help prepare breakfast when she overheard a conversation in the next room. Moody was speaking with his brothers in Persian, but she had learned enough of the language to catch fragments. They were talking about sending the American away and keeping only the child. One of the brothers said something about accidents happen, and everyone laughed. Betty clutched the wall, trying not to faint. She finally understood. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was a temporary inconvenience, being tolerated only because of Matop. That afternoon, Betty made the most terrifying decision of her life. She would no longer try to escape through official channels. She would no longer wait for outside help. She would no longer make elaborate plans that could be discovered. She would do the one thing. She would put her daughter on her back and rock through the snow-covered mountains to Turkey, or die trying. Because the alternative, living knowing that any moment she could be eliminated and Matthew would be raised by people who saw her as property, was unacceptable. Through Ellen, she made final contact with a network of Kurdish smugglers who operated in the mountains between Iran and Turkey. They were blunt about the risks. It was winter, the mountains were buried in snow, the journey would take at least 5 days on foot, and many people died trying. But they were also blunt about one thing. If she really wanted to try, they would take her. The price was $12,000, money she didn't have but would find it. Are you sure? The leader asked. You could die. Your daughter could die. Betty looked at Matip, who was quietly playing in the corner, and said, We already dying here. Out there, at least we have a chance. The final preparations were made in complete secrecy. Betty raised the money by discreetly sealing her jewelry and using what remained of her savings. She studied maps of the mountains, memorized landmarks, and mentally prepared herself for the hardest journey of her life. She didn't tell Matsup where they were going, only that they were going on a special trip and that she needed to be very brave. On the night before the departure, Betty held her sleeping daughter and whispered a prayer, not for survival, though she desperately hoped for it, but that if they died, they would die free, because for the first time in 18 months, Betty Mahmoody was about to take control of her own destiny, and this time she would not fail. The escape began on a freezing morning, January 26, 1986. Betty woke up before dawn, dressed Matsup in layers of heavy clothing, and whispered, Today we're going home. She had told the family she was visiting a sick friend, a lie she had rehearsed for days. Her small backpack carried only the essential, forged documents, hidden cash, medicine, and a blanket. As they walked out of the house, Betty looked back on last time. She knew that if she failed, she would never see that door again. And if she succeeded, she would also never see the door again. The meeting with the smugglers took place in a safe house in the outskirts of Tehran. 3 Kurdish men, their faces weathered by time and mountains, examined Betty and Matub with skeptical eyes. Are you sure? The leader asked one last time. 5 days, snow, cold. Your daughter might not make it. Betty clutched Matthew to her chest. We'll make it, she said. They drove for hours, passing military checkpoints where Betty held her breath, waiting to be discovered. Every guard who looked inside the car was a moment of pure terror, but the forged documents worked. They were just the family visiting relatives. The trek began at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, where snow reached their knees and the wind cut like blades. Betty wasn't prepared for the physical reality of the journey. From the first steps, she realized her boots weren't adequate, her clothes weren't warm enough, her body wasn't strong enough. But she kept going. Matsup, wrapped in blankets and strapped to Betty's back, rarely complained. Are we going home, Mommy? She asked once. Yes, sweetheart, Betty answered. We're going home. That promise kept her moving when her legs wanted to collapse. The second day was the worst. A snowstorm forced them to take shelter in a shallow cave, where they huddled together for warmth. Betty couldn't feel her toes. Matop had a fever. They didn't have enough food. The smugglers began talking about turning back, saying the journey was impossible. No, Betty said, we're not going back. We can't go back. She knew that if they returned, Moody would kill them. She knew this was their only chance. So she did what mothers do. She found strength she didn't know she had. She put Matop on her back again and kept walking through the snow. On the fourth day, they saw the Turkish border, an invisible line in the mountains that meant the difference between captivity and freedom. Betty started to cry, not from sadness, but from a relief so deep she could barely breathe. But they still weren't safe. The final descent was treacherous, with ice-covered rocks and cliffs disappearing into darkness. Betty slipped several times, once almost falling with Matop. But she held on, she gripped, she kept going down. When they finally stepped onto Turkish soil, Betty fell to her knees in the snow. Matop slid off her back, and the two of them clung to each other, sobbing. Did we make it, Mommy? Matop asked. We made it, sweetheart. Betty whispered. We made it. They were free, after 18 months of captivity, 5 days of terror in the mountains, and a journey that nearly killed them. Betty Mahmoody and her 4-year-old daughter were free. But freedom, she would soon discover, was only the beginning of a new journey. Arriving at the American embassy in Ankara was a moment Betty had dreamed of for 18 months, but it hardly felt real. She and Matop, dirty, exhausted, still shaking from the mountain cold, were met by an official who had been alerted to their arrival. You're safe now, a consular officer said, but Betty couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. After so long living in fear, safety felt impossible to believe. Matop, just 4 years old, asked if they were really going home or if this was just another dream. Betty held her daughter and promised, This time it's real, sweetheart. This time we're really going home. The flight back to Michigan was an emotional journey that mirrored their physical escape. In Munich, during a layover, Matop saw fresh raspberries at the hotel breakfast and laughed for the first time in months. You're tricking me, she told Betty. I knew we were in Michigan because these are real raspberries. At Detroit airport, Betty's family was waiting. Flowers, candy, tears, and most importantly, Frank, her father, who had survived cancer out of sheer determination to see them again. When he called out his traditional boo to Matop hiding behind the bathroom door, it felt like the world had finally gone back to normal. But the trauma didn't vanish with freedom. She developed an understandable paranoia. She checked locks obsessively, couldn't sleep without a light on, and jumped at any unexpected sound. Matop had regular nightmares and hid whenever planes flew too low, remembering the bombings in Tehran. They lived like fugitives in their own country, using false names, moving from address to address, always fearing that Moody might show up to claim Matop. Freedom had come at the cost of eternal vigilance. Betty's decision to tell her story publicly was as much about healing as it was about protection. When she wrote Not Without My Daughter with William Hoffer, it wasn't just to process her trauma. It was to make herself too visible to disappear. The more public she became, the harder it would be for Moody to act against them. The book became an international bestseller, and the 1981 film starring Sally Field brought her story to millions of people. But with fame came controversy. Moody and his family in Iran responded with accusations that Betty had fabricated or exaggerated her story, claiming she had been an ungrateful wife who had abandoned a loving husband. Years later, when Matop grew up and wrote her own memoir, My Name is Matop, she confirmed her mother's accounts of events. She described her own memories of fear, confusion, and trauma of a child caught in a situation she couldn't comprehend. More importantly, she wrote about forgiveness, not forgetting, but the conscious choice not to let hatred define her life. She became an advocate for other traumatized children, transforming her pain into purpose. Betty Mahmoody's legacy goes beyond her personal story. Her experience contributed to changes in the U.S. legislation regarding international parental abduction, helping to create protections for other parents in similar situations. She became a voice for women trapped in abusive marriage across cultures, showing that even in the most desperate circumstances, maternal courage can find a way. Her story stands as a testament to a simple but powerful truth. A mother will do anything. Cross mountains, defy entire systems, risk her own life to protect her child. And sometimes, against all odds, a mother's love is strong enough to win. The story of Betty and Mahmoody reminds us of that maternal love can literally move mountains. In a world where oppressive systems try to silence women's voices, On Mother's courage became a cry that echoes for decades, saving not just one life, but inspiring changes that protect thousands of other families. But this is just another story. There are thousands of Muslim women around the world, daughters, wives, mothers, who face similar battles in silence. Some are fighting against tradition that imprisoned them. Others are challenging systems that deny their basic rights. And many are finding extraordinary ways to turn their pain into power. If this story touched your heart, share this video on your social networks. Stories like this need to be told, need to be heard, and need to inspire other women to never stop fighting for freedom. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories that will leave you speechless. Because if you thought Betty's courage was extraordinary, wait until you hear the next story about the women appearing on your screen.